Okay. In October of '61, then, Kennedy sends Taylor and Rostow to Vietnam to find out what's going on. And Taylor's use of language to describe his mission is really interesting here. Taylor says this before he leaves: "The capital question is whether additional forces should be mobilized now, or the limitation of our military capabilities in Southeast Asia accepted as a permanent fact." So that's the question, as Taylor sees it, is whether we should send additional forces to Vietnam now, or whether we should recognize that what we can do there is limited and never move beyond that. And I think this is an attempt by Taylor, I think, to again place the burden on Kennedy's shoulders to pin him down for a decision. All right, so the Taylor-Rostow mission leaves in October of 1961, but at the same time, it's just kind of all these things are kind of merging together here. All these things are merging together here. There is this increased political warfare between the military and the White House going on. And at this point, Lionel McGarr really plays a role on that. McGarr is complaining that the civilians don't want to listen to what the military is saying about Vietnam. Their reports are critical, and especially because they're pointing out that the problems of ZM is having, and the problem that the ARVNs are having. All right, McGarr says there is a slimmer and slimmer chance of pulling this one out of the fire. This is in early '61, and the head of the American Advisory Group in Vietnam, General Lionel McGarr, is saying that we're reaching the point of no return. You know, slimmer and slimmer chance of pulling this one out of the fire. What is McGarr's concern? Well, this is also very telling. It's a very powerful statement, I think. McGarr sees the White House ignoring military reservations about Vietnam. Military is very critical. They have these concerns, and he believes the White House is ignoring what they're telling him. And he's concerned that Kennedy's going to get deeper and deeper and deeper into Vietnam. More and more troops, more and more money. And ultimately he's going to be involved in a war there, a war that will not go well. And who's going to be blamed? Well, the military is, right? So McGarr in 1961 says, "As I am jealous of the professional good name of our Army, I do not wish it to be placed in the position of fighting a losing battle and being charged with the loss." So already in late 1961, the military has this awareness that this is a difficult war. It probably isn't a good idea. We very well could lose, and if we lose, then we're going to be blamed for it. All right? So from that point on, you see a real effort on behalf of the military to avoid blame, to pin down LBJ. All right? So what's happening in Vietnam? Taylor and Rostow are there. They come back, and the way the story traditionally goes is they encouraged Kennedy to send troops to Vietnam under the guise of engineers to repair the infrastructure because the Mekong had recently flooded. So they want to send 8,000 American troops to Vietnam as a flood relief force, but in fact this would just be a cover. They would in fact be trainers and advisors and whatnot. All right? They also, Taylor and Rostow also recommended that the U.S. send more aviation and helicopter units to Vietnam. And everyone says, well, Taylor was an interventionist. He was, trying to get the U.S. more deeply involved in the war, take over the war. All right? I think if you just read Taylor's recommendations, you can make that conclusion. Taylor did recommend sending troops under the guise of flood relief and sending aviation units. But if you read his entire report, which is several pages long, up to the recommendations, it's quite striking because Taylor's report about the situation in Vietnam is really quite bleak. Taylor, like everybody else in Saigon and throughout Vietnam, understands that the situation in Vietnam is not terribly conducive to American success. The VC, the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front, Viet Cong, essentially the same thing, have been gaining strength. They've been gaining recruits. They're successful. The ARVN is weak. The ARVN is passive. We're going to talk more about that later, especially when we talk about John Paul Vann. This is a very controversial aspect to the war, the role of the ARVN. It still raises great passions today, especially among Vietnamese in the United States. I don't want to get into that. I don't know. I mean, so far, no one has really done a detailed study of the ARVN based on documents. What we do know, though, without question, is that the American leadership and many American soldiers in Vietnam did not hold the ARVN in high regard. Whether that's true, whether that's an objective analysis, is still, is out. The jury's out on that because we don't have a whole lot of documentary work on that. But in fact, Americans, including Taylor, did not believe that the ARVN was an effective fighting force. They believed that the ARVN was passive and that the ARVN was going to allow the Americans to take over more and more of the war. All right? And Taylor says that in October of 1961. The VC is strong. The ARVN is passive. The ARVN's intelligence is not very strong. The VC have already infiltrated the ARVN. In addition to that, Taylor is aware of the perils involved in sending troops to Vietnam. He says it's a peripheral area. American forces could be, quote, pinned down for an uncertain duration. Once in Indochina, the American presence will, quote, increase tensions and risk escalation into a major war in Asia. Is Vietnam worth a major war against China? Or a world war? Who knows? And, Taylor goes on, if initial deployments do not produce results, quote, it will be difficult to resist the pressure to reinforce. And unless the U.S. is actually committed to staying the course throughout the whole time, there is no limit to our possible commitment and could lead to attacks against Hanoi itself. This is not a terribly sanguine analysis. Taylor recognizes the problems involved. He says, I have no enthusiasm for U.S. Army forces in ground combat in this guerrilla war, where there will be Americans fighting in a jungle environment. Okay? He says Americans should not be charged with clearing VC out of the South. That's the primary responsibility of the ARVN. And Americans should be there as advisors. Okay? In my own work, I point out that Taylor is an interesting contrast to Ridgway, because in 1954, Matthew Ridgway believed essentially the exact same stuff Maxwell Taylor believed in 1961. But what did Ridgway do? Ridgway voiced his opinion. He came out very strongly against intervention at Dien Bien Phu, very strongly against the training mission, very strongly against support of the Diem government. In 1961, Taylor's analysis isn't terribly different than Ridgway's regarding the problems involved in Vietnam and the problems American soldiers would have there. Taylor, however, is far more political than Ridgway ever was. Taylor was a political general, way more than Ridgway was. Ridgway was an old soldier. But by the 1960s, managers are replacing soldiers within the military hierarchy. And Taylor knows that Kennedy doesn't want to hear him come back and say, let's get out, this is a mess. That's not what Kennedy sent him there for, So and instead of playing a role like Ridgway did in 54, Taylor comes back and writes this very bleak report, but what does he conclude? We should send troops in. I call it a non sequitur. The conclusion does not accord with the assumptions behind it. It's, in a sense, illogical. But politically, it makes sense because this is what Kennedy wanted to hear. Right? McNamara, Rusk, Kennedy are all on the record in favor of saving the Vietnamese. As a result of that, the Taylor-Rostow mission comes back with this recommendation that the U.S. take a larger role in the situation in Vietnam. Because of that, then, the U.S. government, the National Security Council writes NESAM 111. NSAM stands for National Security Action Memorandum. And these are just numbered in the order in which they appear. NESAM 111, authorized by Kennedy, says that the United States will make a, quote, sharply increased joint effort to support southern Vietnam, the RVN. All right? It's interesting, a sharply increased joint effort. That effort will not be joint in the sense that the United States will increasingly take over the war. One of the ironies of this is NESAM 111 was authorized on November 22nd, 1961, exactly 2 years before Kennedy is assassinated, all right? So the United States, by the end of 1961, Kennedy hasn't even been in power, hasn't even been in the White House for a year, is committed to Vietnam, okay? Kennedy then enters his second year in the White House, still committed. Yes?
What you just said was that basically we could see this as the point at which we as a government led by Kennedy, commit to Vietnam?
I think it was before that, actually, in terms of the commitment. This is one of the...
Formal, written?
It's more formal, yeah. I mean, I don't want to make too much out of it. There are others which are more important. But in fact, I mean, I think it's important because it follows on the heels of Taylor-Rostow. You know, and in that regard, it's a formal acknowledgement of Taylor and Rostow's mission, but it doesn't really change anything. It just, yeah, it's you know, kind of formalizes things. I mean, it's just more evidence of where Kennedy was with regard to Vietnam. You have a question, Fred?
Were we already involved? Something stood out to me in our reading. Were we already involved in napalm before our troops were involved? There was something.
Yeah, something? Yeah, and actually, I'll be getting to that. I mean, the U.S. in '62, the U.S. introduces things like napalm and herbicides and whatnot. There's not actual ground combat forces there until 1965. Americans are flying missions with the Vietnamese. They're going out as advisors, but they're carrying weapons with the Vietnamese. But there aren't American troops per se there, nothing like that. So in fact, yeah, a lot of that commitment precedes the introduction of forces. And the introduction of combat forces doesn't occur until March of 1965. By which time the U.S. was well into war. The war is well underway by the time the U.S. actually sends ground combat forces in. So what's the fallout of Taylor-Rostow? Well, Kennedy doesn't send combat troops to Vietnam, but clearly, as NSAM 111 and other documents showed, he did not waver from his commitment to Vietnam. And it's very interesting here to see how Kennedy himself envisioned his own credibility. There were always people, small minority, calling for negotiations in Vietnam as they had in Laos. See, there were those who thought that was the smart way to deal with Laos. Just negotiate, get it over with, clean your hands, walk away. All right? And people were suggesting he do the same thing. Kennedy every time rejected calls for negotiations. In fact, I think Averell Harriman himself told him to negotiate in Vietnam. He says, this is interesting, these are Kennedy's words, if we postpone action in Vietnam to engage in talks with the communists, we can surely count on a major crisis of nerve in Vietnam and throughout Southeast Asia. The image of U.S. unwillingness to confront communism induced by the Laos performance will be definitely confirmed. There will be panic and disarray now. If we negotiate now, while infiltration from the north continues, we shall in fact be judged even weaker than in Laos. For in that case, we at least first insisted on a ceasefire. Right? Listen to Kennedy's words there. A major crisis of nerve. There will be panic and disarray. We will in fact be judged weaker than in Laos. This is really a clear statement on his own conception of credibility. I mean, there are those that go beyond what I do and take this kind of, analyze it on a personal level and talk about Kennedy's own sense of machismo and his, kind of testosterone-driven politics. And I guess you can go there with it, but I don't think you need to. I mean, I think it indicates something on a far larger scale than personal invective or anything like that. Okay, so Kennedy clearly is on the record saying we will stay there. Robert McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, is just as assertive. McNamara meets with military leaders in late '61, early '62, and he says the White House has decided to, quote, pursue the Vietnam affair with vigor, and all reasonable amounts of resources will be placed at the disposal of the commanders in the area. Right, we're willing to stay there and fight, and we'll give you what you need. Okay? What does McNamara also say, kind of foreshadowing things? There's no gimmick which will win the war for us. Air and naval action can contribute, but it's mainly a ground force problem. What else does McNamara say? We're stuck with ZM. Those are McNamara's words, stuck with ZM. They continue to see problems in the South, and above all, they are lamenting that they are stuck with ZM. What else does he say? The guy's not going to reform. You can't expect that. Since 1954, what's the American mantra been? ZM has to reform, we're going to force him to reform. And in '61, McNamara acknowledges he's never going to reform. Because why? Who has leverage in this relationship? ZM does, because he knows, like Chiang Kai-shek knew, like Chiang Kai-shek knew, or like Syngman Rhee in Korea knew, or like Phui, Sinanakoni, and Laos knew. The U.S. isn't going to pull the rug out from under them. So Diem has really no incentive to reform. So McNamara then is on the record as saying, we're going to pursue this with vigor. The situation in Vietnam isn't good. We're stuck with Diem. Lionel McGarr, the American advisor, the commanding general of American advisory effort in Vietnam, says the VC are stronger than ever. Throughout 1961, VC strength rose in the South. And this is a trend which, quote, if continued, can be fatal. McGarr says the enemy controls about 60% of southern Vietnam. We've talked, last week in my exact facsimile, my map of southern Vietnam, you paint it red for VC control. McGarr is saying it's about 60%. Officially, the U.S. is saying that, Diem has things well under control. McGarr is saying the RVN has made little or no progress in developing an overall plan for the war, right? So as far as McNamara and the people in the field are concerned, things in the South aren't going well. We're stuck with Diem. The VC are stronger than ever. They probably control 60% of the country. So what do we do? Well, we better do something. And the solution becomes, again, counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency, time and again, will be trotted out as the solution to America's problems in Vietnam. Did the U.S. really ever make a sincere effort to do that? Not really. All right? And one of the best examples, maybe the best example of the way America got involved in counterinsurgency in Vietnam, was the establishment of the Strategic Hamlets program. And I'll make this briefer than I could, the Strategic Hamlet story, which is quite instructive. We've already talked before about Vietnamese society. And Vietnamese society is very family and village-oriented. People are born in a particular village. The villages are often isolated. They don't move beyond those villages. It's, kind of compared to Western society, fairly primitive or feudal, right? In that village, you have, your neighbors and your family. You raise crops on your land. You have religious services on your land. Your land is inhabited by the spirits of your ancestors. You have burial grounds on your land. It is a village-oriented society. All right? The Viet Cong very successfully have infiltrated themselves into these villages, or even more likely recruited people. People in those villages have their own complaints against the Diem regime, and they've joined the National Liberation Front. Just because somebody is a peasant does not mean he is apolitical. And just because that peasant may not be literate, he may not be, sophisticated, but there are many ways to express one's displeasure, all right? I mean, Diem is the guy sending the tax collectors into the village, for example. They don't like that. So at the village level, if one is to believe McGarr, 60% of the villages are controlled by the Front and the Viet Cong. Now, Douglas Pike and the Americans would say they're doing this through sheer terror. I mean, I think people like Dwight and Marr would point out that statistically that's just not possible. There aren't enough, and they don't have enough power to do this through sheer terror. They are actually making a political pitch that resonates throughout the Vietnamese countryside. What's the pitch? Diem is bad for you. He's charging too much in taxes. We're better for you. We'll reform land. Look at what Ho did in 46. Look at what he did in 54. We will give you a better life. All right? And the United States realizes that, for whatever reason, the Viet Cong are very successfully making inroads at the village level among rural Vietnamese. And they want to stop that. How do you do it? All right? Well, this is difficult because you don't really know who the Vietnamese are, the Viet Cong are. I mean, quite often people in that village are VC. It's the old story, American friends by day, VC by night. Vietnamese by day, VC by night, however they put it. So you can't go in and what do you do? I mean, one way is just to kind of get rid of everybody. Duck hunting, you shoot enough, up in the air, you're going to get the ducks, right? And as we'll see, that is part of this, but initially they would do what today I guess would be called surgical strikes. We want to isolate people who we know are Viet Cong, but how do you know that? So they finally decide to do something totally different. They decide to establish counterpoints to areas which are considered VC strongholds. Instead of getting rid of the VC, they're going to get rid of the village. All right? They establish what they call strategic hamlets. A hamlet is a village. There are hamlets all over Vietnam, right? But they're not strategic hamlets. What's a strategic hamlet? A strategic hamlet is a hamlet relocated to a strategic point which will be excluded from VC influence. How do you do that? You move everybody. You create a hamlet in an area under American control, or under ARVN control. You put barbed wire, bamboo, punji sticks, things like that around it. You move everybody from the village in there, and then you make sure that the VC can't get at them. You're essentially creating what, you use the term concentration camp. Keep in mind, we're not talking about World War II Nazi-style concentration camps. If you know anything about the Boer War or the Spanish War in Cuba, they established concentration camps there, relocated people in allegedly safe areas. It's like that. This isn't, we're not talking about the type of concentration camps in World War II, but these are similar to concentration camps. Right? They relocate Vietnamese villagers from their home villages and put them in strategic hamlets. And here's a, okay, look at that. What do you see around the edge? Barbed wire fences. All right? Now, you live in a village. You've lived there your whole life. Everybody in your family, for as far back as you can trace your lineage, just lived there. Your parents, your grandparents are buried in that land. Your pigs and your farm is on that land. All right? All of a sudden, they take you. The trucks come in, they put you in, you carry a bag on your back, and you're gone. All right? This is a way to teach you that the VC are bad. What do you come out of this with? Are you upset at the VC because you've been relocated? Who are you upset about? Who are you upset at?
The U.S.
The U.S. and the ARVN, the government, ZM.
Yeah.
They're the ones who moved you, right?
Off of land that you've been on, in some cases, perhaps centuries.
Oh, it could be, yeah. It easily could be. I mean, Francis Fitzgerald's book, Fire in the Lake, is very good on this. You know, and again, this is the kind of stuff Lansdale understood. You know, that there's a culture and a tradition and a heritage here. And if you go in ignorant of that or dismissive of it, you're doing it at your own peril. So what's the net effect, to jump ahead to the conclusion? The strategic hamlets, do they prevent the VC from infiltrating? In fact, they are a breeding ground for VC recruitment. Why? Because everybody in the strategic, a lot of people in strategic hamlets are pissed off at the Americans and at the ARVN, at the ZM government for relocating them. They don't want to be there in the first place. And it's an enclosed place. If they're a VC in there, they're there. They're stuck. They can proselytize, right? They're part of the community. So in fact, strategic hamlets is a horrendous failure. In fact, it does more in 1962 to strengthen the VC and to help them recruit than anything else does. All right? So this is how America goes about counterinsurgency. This is a very kind of Western-oriented approach to counterinsurgency. Is this winning people's hearts and minds? No, it's relocating them. It is basically a technical solution to a problem that is more political, ideological, or morale-oriented. All right? So again, this is, you know, Kennedy's committed. He's got to do something. What's he do? Well, we're going to try counterinsurgency again. We're going to establish strategic hamlets, and it fails. Right? Yeah.
I believe this predated the concept of the creation of the freeze-fire zone outside of those hamlets. Is that correct? Because I didn't see anything in the readings. That came later.
Yeah, it does. You really won't see that expression until probably after the ground forces come in. But John Paul Vann, as early as '63, will be complaining about that. Yeah, free fire zones actually becomes almost an official term. But a free fire zone basically means that you are allowed to engage anybody you see there in combat on the presumption that they are Viet Cong, all right? Which, of course, yeah.
But the idea that if the area is outside of the strategic hamlet, everyone outside those hamlets is considered to be VC. But there was no policy to go after those areas on a bombing run or anything like that in this period of time, 61, 62, or was there?
John Paul Vann would say yes, there was. In fact, the U.S. is, I mean, the Vietnamese are. The U.S. is not flying these missions, but the Vietnamese are. Yeah, actually, they are attacking, sometimes with air, but usually with artillery, villages. I mean, Vann will claim it's just disastrous, it's indiscriminate. Yeah. But you do see, I mean, Vann's there in '62. Yeah. Yeah. So he's already complaining about it by then. And others are recognizing it too. Yeah. At the same time this is going on, there's also a political problem within the American military mission in Vietnam, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Although I think it is important because it really shows more about Kennedy's commitment. Remember, the American group, the military group in Vietnam from 1954 onward was referred to as the MAAG, the Military Assistance Advisory Group. And this is a group of advisors. But in 1962, that's going to change. It's going to be reorganized as the MACV, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam. What does this mean? That the U.S. makes a commitment to move away from an advisorial, an advisory role into a more command-oriented assistance role. It means the U.S. is going to take over more responsibility for the war. And it's interesting because politically there's a little bit more to it than that. The United States moves from advice to assistance, all right? And what commits one deeper, advice or assistance? I mean, if I advise you to do something, you know, I have some responsibility. But if I start assisting you and abetting you, then I'm far more deeper in far more deeply, all right? At the same time, the United States also gets rid of one of the main pains in the butt in Vietnam, Lionel McGarr. Very few people know about McGarr. He's not even mentioned in most books on Vietnam. You can't even find him in the index, but it's really quite striking because McGarr is constantly prodding the White House about what's going on in Vietnam. His memos are very bleak. Situation's bad, the government's bad, the VC controls 60%, and you know, time and again, you see this kind of recognition of what's happening in Vietnam. People are finally tired of it. This isn't what Kennedy wants to hear. Kennedy didn't send McGarr down there, I don't think. I think Eisenhower did. But Kennedy doesn't keep him there to hear this, you know. Kennedy's made a decision, and you either get on the team or you get out. And McGarr's not being a good team player. So by late 1962, there is a clear effort to get rid of him. People like Lansdale and other military people are saying, we got to get rid of McGarr. He's not doing anything. We need somebody who's really going to ride herd on the ARVN. That's the problem. We're not tough enough with the ARVN. Right? McGarr's the guy who's saying, look, they're letting us do more and more. And McGarr's saying the problem is that we're taking over the war, where they're saying, well, no, the problem is you're not tough enough on the ARVN. So there's really a fundamental disagreement there on how to do things. All right? The Americans, instead of focusing on what needed to be done in Vietnam, isolated an individual. Instead of focusing on the job, they said, no, what we have to do is find the right man. The job is fine. It's the guy there who's the problem. So what do? They essentially get rid of McGarr. There's essentially a coup in Saigon, and in December of 1963, they establish a new command structure, and they get rid of Lionel McGarr. They get rid of the MAAG as well. 62, well, it's kind of 62, 63. It's both, you know, late 62, early 63. When they do this, McGarr doesn't go quietly into that good night. He, in fact, continues to complain. He says, I am professionally and personally disappointed, and especially he is upset that his, quote, frank periodic reports. He admits, I've been sending you frank reports. I've been telling you truthfully what I think is going on down here. Nonetheless, they have prevented you from trying to solve a very nonetheless, you are trying to solve, quote, a very unconventional situation in a basically conventional manner. And he's right, absolutely right. As I said, I mean, they're strategic hamlets, which just really ignore what's going on. All right? What else does he say? He says, you're giving more power to ZM. Right? You know, ZM, despite his repression, despite the corruption, you're giving him more power because you keep sending him money. You're giving him virtual veto power, right? So McGarr is ousted because, as he says, he complains because the U.S. is trying to solve an unconventional situation in a conventional way. They need to find a replacement for him. Well, the consensus among people in Washington is that his replacement ought to be General William Yarborough. William Yarborough is a commander at Fort Bragg. And what's at Fort Bragg? Special Forces School. They believe that somebody from Special Forces should be sent to Vietnam because this is a counterinsurgency war. Okay? Kennedy overrides that and sends a guy named General Paul Harkins to Vietnam. What was Harkins' background? Tank commander, protege of Maxwell Taylor. Unimaginative, yet very well connected politically. I mean, Taylor's a big man on campus, so Harkins uses that to his advantage, and he becomes the first MACV commander. The ugly acronym for this is, which you'll see in books quite often, is COMUS MACV. which means Commander, U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. All right, especially with regard to Westmoreland, you'll see that time and again. And what is Harkins's approach to the war? The American Army concept. Build up the ARVN so that they can smash the enemy's main force units, and then the special forces will clean up afterward. Right? That's not the way the war in Vietnam is being fought. Harkins is, as I think I've cited this quote before, it's kind of what Dorothy Parker said about Hepburn. Her range of emotions ran from A to B. Harkins' imagination ran from A to B. Okay? Basically, this is the traditional concept. We're going to smash the enemy and we'll wipe them out after. This is absurd. There are no main force units in the South to fight. The PAVN's not going to get involved in any full measure for a long, long time. There's some limited PAVN activity in the North, but nothing really that's determinative. So for Harkins in 1962 to be saying this is really, really unimaginative, really absurd. All right? Harkins says that we have advantages in technology, air mobility, armor, tanks, and things like that. You can call in air support to flush out the VC, and then we can attack them from the ground. Right? Again, he's fighting a war that doesn't exist. This isn't the Vietnamese War. This isn't the way it's being fought. This isn't what the Viet Cong are doing. They're not massing in huge formations that can be flushed out by air power and then encircled and assaulted. Right? So this is Harkins' approach, and he's in charge, so he gets his way. In 1962, then, you start to see huge amounts of American resources pour in, and for a time bring success. One could make a strong case that this was in a sense the high point of the U.S. effort. Beginning in January of 1962, the White House begins to send far more resources into Vietnam, including, and the Bassett and Pell's article in that reader is really essential for studying this. It's quite good. In 1962, the White House begins sending helicopter companies into Vietnam, fixed-wing aircraft, troop carrier squadron, with aircraft operating not only out of southern Vietnam but also the Philippines, reconnaissance airplanes, spy planes, air control, air traffic controllers, air control personnel, equipment for crop defoliation, herbicides, Navy minesweepers, more advisors, and also approves the use of napalm against the Viet Cong. Napalm is a gaseous gel that sears one's flesh. All right? So it is a commitment not only to air war, but also to chemical warfare. All right? Napalm was used by the French, supplied by the Americans, made by Dow Chemical. Napalm was used by the French at Dien Bien Phu. It is a kind of a more effective improvement upon the types of things used in World Wars I and II, mustard gas and stuff like that. Napalm is even better that way. And things like Agent Orange, the dioxin, which the goal of these herbicides is to eliminate the jungle cover that the VC are using. What is the Air Force's motto become? Only you can prevent a forest. Okay? And these are all products of Kennedy. 1962, I mean, so far up to this point, the Viet Cong have kind of had their way, and the enemy is not putting up a very effective fight. And so when all this stuff appears in Vietnam, quite suddenly, the VC they are sent reeling. The initial introduction of American technology is very difficult for the National Liberation Front, for the Viet Cong. They've been fighting a war which would be considered primitive by Western standards in some ways. And all of a sudden, boom, all this stuff appears in Vietnam. And the Americans are quite proud and quite happy about the path the war has taken. And in 1962, things start to look good. In fact, in late 62, McNamara, Kennedy, Rusk, and others start talking about withdrawing American troops. Now, later on, Kennedy's defenders would say, hey, he was pulling troops out of Vietnam. That indicates he wasn't committed, and after the election, he would have gotten out. Kennedy did ultimately actually withdraw 1,000 troops. Why did the U.S. withdraw troops? Because they thought things were going well. It wasn't because they didn't want to be there, it's just they thought they didn't need them anymore. That in 1962, the war was in good shape. American technology, Americans begin, American advisors fly missions with Vietnamese pilots, napalm and so forth. It really, what did Harkins say about napalm? It really puts the fear of God into the VC. And this stuff is effective for a time. All right? And Americans are quite optimistic. In fact, Bobby Kennedy, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, makes a visit to Saigon in 1962, and he says, "We are going to win in Vietnam. We will remain here until we do win." This is Bobby Kennedy, who would later become, a very strong critic of the war. But in 1962, he's saying, "We're going to stay here. We will win." And there's a fair amount of optimism in Vietnam. Because of the reforms or the improvements of 1962, the ARVN has number of soldiers in the ARVN has risen up to 220,000 from about 180. The Civil Guard has gone up to 77,000. The SDC Self-Defense Corps has gone up to about 100,000. What's the U.S. presence in Vietnam now? 11,000 advisors, although many of them are involved in far more than advising. 300 American aircraft, 120 American helicopters, heavy weapons, American pilots now flying combat missions, defoliants, and napalm. One American advisor who was generally very pessimistic, Wilbur Wilson, said in late 1962, "The tide has turned." And this was the general consensus. The introduction of these aircraft, minesweepers, advisors, napalm, and so forth, the increases in the size of the ARVN and self-defense corps, they've made a difference, and we now are finally have turned the corner. We're on the road to victory. Okay? And that's the general line, except for people in Vietnam. That type of optimism, which was prevalent in Washington, D.C., in the media, I mean, who are the most famous reporters in Vietnam, from Vietnam era? Neil Sheehan and David Halberstam. I think you can make a strong case that those two are. I don't think there's any question to it. Halberstam and Sheehan were initially advocates of the war. And in 1962, their reports initially were somewhat optimistic. They began to turn. Why? Because they thought the war was a bad idea? No, because they thought it was going poorly. And why did they think that? Because their main source in Vietnam was telling them that, John Paul Vann. John Paul Vann is one of the more famous Americans to come out of Vietnam because of Neil Sheehan's book, which was actually turned into a movie for HBO or something, which I never saw, called Bright Shining Lie. And Vann is a really remarkable character, fairly young at the time, well-connected. He was a colonel, destined to certainly become a general, who knows, Army Chief of Staff, whatever. However, he was arrested for statutory rape. He had been having an affair with like a 15-year-old babysitter, and he was able to beat the charge. He beat the lie detector test, but it was quite clear that his days in the Army were numbered. He would later come back as a civilian to Vietnam, but he was clearly, on a path toward, guts and glory. And Vann was well connected, and he knew Sheehan and Halberstam, and he was feeding him a lot of information. And the story that Vann and other military critics were giving was quite different than the one Kennedy was telling people. I mean, Kennedy and Harkins's version was that everything's great, we have them on the run, this thing's going to be over before you know it. Vann and others are giving a quite different story. Right? Vann is especially upset that Harkins's use of firepower, artillery, air power, and so forth, is leading to indiscriminate attacks on peasant hamlets. The question you asked a few minutes earlier. This is 62 already. Vann is saying, we round all these people up and then we just blow them all away. All right? We go into a hamlet and that hamlet's red. It means it's VC controlled. So what do? We bomb it. That VC control, that doesn't necessarily have to mean everybody in that village is Viet Cong. It might mean that the Viet Cong have a strong presence there. But if you blow everybody away, or if you blow the village away, what is that likely to do to the Viet Cong's level of influence there? It's going to make it go up. Because it wasn't the VC. The VC doesn't have an air force. PAVN doesn't. The North Vietnamese don't have an air force. Who has an air force? The Americans do. So if bombs fall out of the sky onto your village, it's pretty easy to know who to blame. The Americans are doing this, they would claim, to eliminate the enemy. And what Vann and advisors in the field are saying is, that's not the enemy. They're people. They have legitimate grievances against the government. And if you use firepower against them and kill their cow or blow up their hut or, God forbid, kill one of their family members, they're going to hate you. And they're going to be even more likely to go to the enemy's side. And the front, the NLF, the VC are going to go into the village and they're going to use this as a propaganda tool, and it's going to be quite effective. Right? What you're doing is you're indiscriminately bombing these peasant hamlets. You're committing brutalities against the people of Vietnam. And in the end, and this is Van talking, Van is saying, Harkins and the U.S. is doing more to help VC and NLF recruiting and propaganda than anything that Ho Chi Minh and the North could ever do. All right? What do the commanders think of Van? They think he's a rebel, he's a troublemaker, he's a maverick. The military generally does not reward this kind of iconoclasm. Yeah.
What was he doing there?
He was an advisor. He was an Army advisor to the 7th ARVN Division. Wilbur Wilson, the guy I just mentioned, was also an advisor. And before '62, Wilson's reports were very similar to Van's, and actually they would turn out to be that way anyway. There's a great story out there that hasn't been written yet about differences in the American military command between the senior leadership and the junior officers, the field grade officers. From what little I know about it, field grade officers had a quite different view of the war than people did in air conditioning of Saigon, air conditioned offices of Saigon. People who were in the field, who were field advisors to the ARVN, were much less optimistic and quite candid, and in fact, in some ways, very sympathetic to the enemy. They understood the political conditions in Vietnam way better than the senior leadership did. You have a question?
A question about Robert McNamara. He hadn't visited Saigon at this time, right? He comes later. And
his first trip, he may have made a visit in '61 or '62. He's been there, yeah. But again, I mean, when a guy like McNamara goes to Saigon, they're not going to take him out into a contested village. You know, he's basically going to talk to people in Saigon. He's going to meet with Ziem and the ARVN and groups like that. So, yeah, I kind of wonder, you know, I mean, it's kind of interesting to see later, whenever Americans are in Vietnam, the VC, you know, of course, get wind of it, and they will make a point of staging something for the benefit of these Americans. Yeah. So this is Van's critique. And what happens to Van? Well, Maxwell Taylor is appointed chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Van actually gets a meeting with him, and he says, Harkins is there too. So every time Van says something about, you know, we're killing people or we're blowing up villages, Harkins would immediately say, no, we're not. He would either, Van says, he presented views and or overrode key points that I tried to make. So Van's dissent gets nowhere. As a result, Halberstam in the New York Times on October 20th, 1962 writes, the closer one gets to the actual contact level of the war, the farther one gets from official optimism. So even though things are going great, you listen to Van and others, and things aren't going so well. The New York Times reports, this war is being officially reported to look good on short-range progress reports, but some basic things just aren't being corrected, and I don't know if we're in a position to correct them. That's an anonymous source, probably Van. Okay? Van's not alone. I mean, the one thing that I tried to do in Masters of War is to show that Van was not an anomaly, that there were many Vans, that there were many bright shining lights in Vietnam. All right? A group of American officers toured Vietnam in 1962 at the height of official optimism, and they said things aren't that good. They said Ziem had retained absolute control to the point of refusing to arm certain units in the ARVN. Why? Because he didn't trust them. He was afraid that there would be a coup attempt. So there were ARVN units unarmed because the commanders of those units were Ziem opponents. So he was arming the ARVN based on the loyalty of those commanders to his own regime. One American officer, kind of being a little sarcastic, said the ARVN is pervaded by apathy and equally proficient at attacking an open rice field with nothing in it and quickly bypassing any heavily wooded area that might possibly contain a few VC. Ziem has given orders to his commanders not to engage the enemy and not to take losses. He doesn't want to have to answer to people who have their soldiers killed or their sons or daughters killed or whatever. So basically the ARVN understands that they should avoid contact with the enemy, thus they're equally proficient at attacking an open rice field. So they will go into an area where they know there aren't any VCs and stage an engagement and come back and report, yeah, we met the enemy and we chased them away. But if there's an area where they know they're a VC, they're going to bypass it. And this is Van, this is these Army. I mean, I've seen mega reports that indicate that. Again, don't know if it's true, but this is clearly the way the American military feels about it. One officer in his report concluded, the military and political situation in South Vietnam can be aptly described by 4 words, quote, it is a mess. The Army's Pacific Command, I think at the time headed by General Dwight Beach, no, Beach is later, I'm sorry. The Army's Pacific Command says that the Viet Cong, quote, undoubtedly still retain the initiative and are free to set the pattern of military action. The naval attaché in Saigon, Commander Everett Park, says, we must not expect to see a sudden dramatic improvement. We are up against people who are capable of outsitting us and outweighting us. And unless we make up our minds to get this thing put into a long-term perspective, we are deluding ourselves. This is in 1962. An American Army report says that the enemy, the Viet Cong, has increased its strength, 22,000 main force units. I'll talk about the way the VC is established later. 22,000 main force units, 120,000 guerrillas, untold numbers of political supporters. They're infiltrating about 1,000 guerrillas monthly. There are over 17,000 conventional PAVN forces near the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, the 17th parallel. The VC's logistics support is quite strong. Military activity continues. The ZM regime is no more effective than it ever was, and so on and so forth. No need in beating a dead horse here. In fact, well, I will beat it one more time. Maxwell Taylor in 1962, November of 62, reports the Vietnamese were supposed to have established 11,000 strategic hamlets. 1962, November, they had established only 600, which could be considered properly administered. All right? So this is the prelude then to Kennedy's final year. All right? And the year starts off on a bad note because of Ap Bak. Now, although Van and other military critics were saying, hey, we've got some real problems here, the official line coming out of Washington was that everything was going well. Everything was great. American power had made a difference, and we're going to wrap this thing up. We may even be home. You know, we're going to start withdrawing troops and so forth. Well, in the first days of 1963, that's proven wrong. In fact, a group of Army officers in Vietnam on January 2nd, 1963, said things are going better than they were a year ago, but not nearly as well as Harkins and others might suggest. Well, on January 2nd, 1963, that idea that things aren't going as well as Harkins suggests clearly comes true. Ap Bak is in the Mekong Delta. I don't remember if it's on this map or not. It's in the Mekong. It's down south here. It's not on the map specifically. But you kind of get the idea. This is the Mekong. And this is really a stronghold for the enemy. This is one of the enemy's real strong points. It's about 35 miles southwest of Saigon. So let's see. It's right here. It's right outside Saigon, Ap Bak. All right? Just a little bit outside of Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon. Outside of Ap Bak, American military officials were pressuring the ARVN to win a victory. Basically, already there was some mumbling that the ARVN wasn't fighting. The Americans were doing everything. And so the Americans begin to put pressure on the ARVN to do something. And they figure Ap Bak is the perfect place to do it. They know the VC are there. They can rout them. They can create like a set-piece battle because they know where the enemy is. There are some enemy main force units there. The ARVN has a 4-to-1 troop advantage. In addition to that, they have American artillery, armor, and helicopters. This is the ARVN's 7th Division. And I think, in fact, I know, John Paul Vann was the advisor to the ARVN 7th. So they figure Ap Bak is the perfect place. This is a demonstration battle. They tell reporters about it, and everybody comes out expecting to see the ARVN wipe out the VC at Ap Bak. It doesn't turn out that way. It's a disaster. The VC dominated the field. The initial introduction of helicopters into Vietnam dazzled the Viet Cong. They didn't know what to do. By January of 1963, they had undergone intensive training in anti-aircraft activity. They had developed or they acquired new technology, and so they knew how to handle what they saw coming that day. They inflicted heavy damage on the ARVN troops. They killed 3 American advisors, and they shot down 5 American helicopters. The ARVN did not use armored personnel carriers, and in fact, the ARVN broke ranks and ran rather than incur casualties. Vann was furious. the VC appeared outnumbered 4-1 and sent the ARVN scampering back. Okay? And Van wrote a huge 20-some page long detailed report, a scathing attack on the 7th Division afterward. Opp-Bach shocked Americans, except, as Halberstam said, the only people not surprised are the American advisors in the field. It didn't surprise them at all that it happened this way. Some Americans tried to put the best face on it. Harkin said it was a great success. Van went ballistic. Van said the ARVN is poorly trained, they're afraid to fight, they have no discipline, they broke ranks, and in fact, this loss will be turned into a propaganda weapon and will provide the enemy with a morale-building victory. At that same time, there was an American military mission in Vietnam, and I think this is interesting because it was led by General Edward Rowney, R-O-W-N-Y. Is that name familiar to anybody? Star Wars. Rowney became Mr. Star Wars in the Reagan administration. Rowney's not a dove, right? But what did Rowney see in January of 1963? All right. Harkins is a good officer. He's competent, but he's not imaginative in driving. He's not highly motivated or creative. All right. Rowney says, Van's right. The ARVN, he attacks the ARVN for its considerable delay in waiting for airstrikes, for allowing the VC to escape. Basically, Van and Rowney are saying the ARVN's letting the VC escape. They want to. They don't want to fight him. They're allowing him. They're creating an open field for them to get away. And for its brutal habit, this is Rowney. This is General Edward Rowney speaking. He criticizes the ARVN for its brutal habit of capturing or shooting anyone left in a bombed-out village on the grounds of being, quote, suspected VC. It's the old Army saying if it's dead and it's Vietnamese, it's VC. Because why? McNamara, I'll talk about this later too. What's the success? What's the gauge for success? The body count. McNamara says, well, we can't judge this by how much territory we've taken. You know, we can't have the Battle of the Bulge, so we'll win by killing more of them than they kill of us. So after battle, quite seriously, you go out and you count the number of enemy dead. I mean, I've heard people, I don't know if they were serious or not, vets say, yeah, we counted dead buffalo. And, you know, but any Vietnamese dead was considered enemy because you had to build up that body count because McNamara didn't want any of that damn poetry. He wanted something you could put into the computer. He wanted data. Rowney says the ARVN soldiers do not really want to tangle with the enemy. Why? Because ZM has prohibited them from losing. There is a prohibition against defeat. If you want your career to hit the stomach block, lose a battle. So you avoid it instead. There is excessive caution. All right? So Opp-Bach then is really telling in that although the Americans claim things are going well, the situation in the field in Vietnam is not nearly going so well. And this will lead to kind of the denouement of the Kennedy era in Vietnam. And once again, I got too clever by half. Pretty soon they'll find out that there's no way out. All right? The situation within Vietnam becomes impossible in 1963. The ZM regime cannot be propped up any longer. And there are three major things going on here. One, ZM and the Americans are starting to really get in each other's nerves. Two, the Buddhist situation, which I've mentioned before, becomes a major crisis. And three, which may be the most important one, it's the one least talked about, ZM begins talking to the enemy. All right? First, ZM and America tensions. Publicly, of course, the United States has to continue to believe that ZM is the Winston Churchill of Southeast Asia. They said it, it must be true. Privately, however, internally, America's relationship with ZM is getting worse and worse. And this is surprising. I mean, first time I saw this, it was quite surprising. Why? Because ZM is tired of the Americans. ZM does have nationalist credentials. He doesn't want the Americans taking over his country. Now, he does want them sending the checks. He's not that proud. He's not saying, you know, I won't take your money. He's just saying, I'll take your money. You just don't tell me what to do. Okay? The Americans have what ZM calls privileged semi-diplomatic status. One American Marine official said, the U.S. arrogance of power is manifested in an attitude which is much said, get out of the way, I'll do it myself. ZM doesn't like that. He doesn't mind having Americans there, although he doesn't want too many of them. He certainly doesn't mind getting money from America, but he does not want Americans telling his army what to do and how to do it. He hates Van. You know, he hates people like Van because they're critical and they're exposing the things he says, like, he doesn't want his soldiers to, he doesn't want to lose soldiers, he doesn't want to lose battles. What happens then? Well, by mid-1963, by the spring of 1963, the U.S. government and ZM really are experiencing a lot of tension. This comes from a CIA report, right? ZM and his brother Nhu are concerned about recent infringements of Vietnamese sovereignty. The Americans are taking over a sovereign country. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? I mean, isn't this the VC propaganda line? The Americans are taking over Vietnam, and ZM basically recognized that this is true, right? ZN is allowing additional time for further blunders. This is the CIA. Pretty soon, ZM will confront Nolting and Harkins with irrefutable evidence of U.S. responsibility for various problems, various blunders that have been going on, and he will demand a reduction in the number of U.S. personnel in South Vietnam on the basis that the American force is too large and unmanageable. So the U.S. expects ZM to demand a reduction in American forces. Why? Because the Americans are not controllable, they're taking over, and they're really damaging Vietnamese sovereignty. ZM will insist, this is the CIA, that American military advisors be reduced. What's the U.S. want to do? Increase. The U.S. is trying to send more forces in, and ZM is insisting that they be reduced. Okay? What then can the U.S. do? Frederick Nolting says, we have no alternative but to take actions designed to convince ZM that we mean business. This guy doesn't want us there. He's complaining about it. So what do we have to do? We have to make sure he knows that we mean business. Is listening to ZM and decreasing the role an option? No. We have to, convince him that we mean business. All right. What else does that mean? It means that the U.S. is aware that there are elements inside Vietnam who might try to get rid of ZM. So the No family has become something of an embarrassment to the United States. I have this up just because it's a priceless picture, and I had to figure out some way to put it on there. But this is Madame Nhu. This is ZM's sister-in-law showing the Vietnamese women's soldiers group. She considered herself a feminist, and she established this Vietnamese women's paramilitary group, and she's showing them there in her high heels how to shoot. Right. This is the woman who was considered the stereotypical dragon lady. Right. Very exotic and beautiful and whatnot, and so she also packs heat. So. It's a great picture. I had to put it in there somewhere, right? So, ZM and the U.S. are increasingly at odds. And this is going to get much worse because of continued problems between Catholics and Buddhists, which we've already spoken to. Before I get to the events of 63, just a little bit more background on Buddhism, because this is interesting. In the 1950s and 1960s, the United States, one of the reasons ZM was popular is because he was well connected in the U.S., and he was well connected because he was a Catholic and had developed contacts with people like Francis Cardinal Spellman, John Kennedy, Mike Mansfield, Justice William O. Douglas, a Supreme Court liberal who was actually very favorably impressed. So the Americans like ZM because he's a Catholic, but at the same time, the Americans are suspicious of Buddhists. So this kind of, it creates a little bit of a more complex situation there. In fact, William O. Douglas, famous liberal Supreme Court justice, in 1953 wrote a book called North from Malaya, and he talks about Vietnam in it, and he's quite impressed with ZM. And he said that ZM is honest and independent, and he's a Catholic. Douglas says that the Buddhist church, however, is remote from the people and country. It is a passive institution. It teaches very little social or community responsibility. It concerns itself with devotions, with women, which women especially practice. It exists strangely apart from the conflict that is tearing the nation apart. This is William O. Douglas talking about Buddhists in Vietnam. He couldn't have been more wrong. This is a great liberal Douglas, right? And this is typical of Americans as they look at Vietnam and the religious composition there. The Americans favor the Catholics over the Buddhists. Mike Mansfield, John Kennedy were also Catholics that way. All right. At the same time, the Americans see the religious sects in Vietnam, like the Hoa Hao and the Cao Dai, who I mentioned last week. And they also have misgivings about them because they practice these weird religions, right? The Hoa Hao, Time magazine said, was a rowdy sect of dissident Buddhists whose founder was sent to a lunatic asylum. So this is the background to that. The sects, according to a magazine in the United States, are capitalizing on harebrained offshoots of Buddhism. Buddhism is passive. They're pacifists, they're crazy, they're lunatics, and they're creating all these sects. So America mistrusts the dominant religion in Vietnam, Buddhism. All right? Not surprisingly, then, Diem doesn't think he has anything to worry about when, in 1963, he engages in open repression of Buddhists. Diem, remember, is a Catholic. Catholics are a minority in Vietnam, probably about 10%. But they overwhelmingly populate areas of, or positions of influence within the civil and military regime. Generals and civil administrators, many convert in order to, yeah.
Did they control a lot of the wealth?
Yeah,
The
disproportionately,
Catholics?
yeah.
Okay.
Although some of these sects also have influences. Chinese have wealth too, but the Catholics tend to do pretty well. They're fairly well off. They're more educated. They have connections to the old French regime and the political and economic administration. So yeah, they tend to be pretty well off. Not all, but many are. So Diem and the Catholics and the Buddhists never got along terribly well to begin with, and this really becomes a problem in 1963, beginning in May of '63. Buddha's birthday is May 8th, okay? And there's going to be a major Buddhist celebration in Hue, which is one of the, as I've said before, right here is Hue, which is kind of one of the headquarters, the temple at Hue, the Buddhist temple at Hue, one of the oldest and kind of most revered, like a great church would be in the United States or something like that.
Is that H-U-I?
H-U-E.
E?
Yeah, H-U-E. There's a big celebration planned for Buddha's birthday, which is May 8th, and Diem tells the provincial officials there to enforce a ban on flying religious flags, meaning flying Buddhist flags. So there is a law in the books that says you cannot display a Buddhist flag, and Diem tells the provincial officials in Hue to enforce that law. Now, just a few weeks before that, one of Diem's brothers, who was the Archbishop of Hue, Ngo Dinh Thuc, had a big celebration, and they had displayed Vatican flags prominently. Vatican flags had been in the processional and whatnot, but now Diem's saying no Buddhist flags. Well, so what do the Buddhists do? They raise their flags and they march in this procession, and they schedule a big meeting to celebrate Buddha's birthday. Local officials, Diem loyalists, tell the crowd to disperse, and when the Buddhists don't disperse, the deputy province chief, who's a Catholic, orders his troops to fire, killing 9 Buddhists, including women and children, and many others were injured. What does Diem do? He says that a Viet Cong hand grenade caused the deaths. And even when they showed film, of the soldiers firing on, Diem refused. He could have been on a jury in Simi Valley, huh? So Diem, clearly this has escalated now. What does it mean for the Buddhists? It means that Buddhist militants now come to the forefront of the Buddhist movement. All right? It radicalizes the Buddhists because they realize they're dealing with somebody here who's not going to compromise with them, and it marks a period of increased political importance for the Buddhist Church. This crisis, more than anything, publicly becomes the face of Vietnam in the United States. The U.S. doesn't know a whole lot about Vietnam, and what they've heard is that Diem is the Mandarin in the sharkskin suit who's saving Vietnam from the communists. But all of a sudden, you have these massive demonstrations now, all right? And people are starting to look at Diem not as this, kind of Mandarin in the sharkskin, but as something more than that, something a little more troubling than that. Just 2 days after the Buddhist killings on May 8th, there's a huge demonstration in Hue with over 10,000 people participating. Diem, however, remains obdurate and begins jailing Buddhist leaders claiming that they are communist agents. And in fact, he also begins to put in jail anybody who supports the Buddhists, including members of student groups. This all comes to a head with perhaps the most famous picture out of the Vietnam era. All right? On June 11th, 1963, Thich Quang Duc, a Buddhist bonze, a monk, goes to Main Street in Saigon, douses himself with gasoline. The world media had been alerted to be in Saigon at that point, and sets himself on fire. All right? This is on the front page of every newspaper in the world just about the next day. When Americans see this, they're of course shocked. And pretty soon there are other Buddhist bonzes who immolate themselves to protest Diem. So what does Diem do? He promises that he won't attack the Buddhists anymore, and he'll give them equal rights and that kind of thing. Never enforced it. And in fact, the persecution, the arrest of the Buddhists continue. Diem and his brother would publicly always say that it was the Viet Cong who were causing all these problems. These weren't Buddhists, these were VC. Okay? Diem's sister-in-law, Madame New, who we just saw teaching Vietnamese women how to shoot, called Thich Quang Duc and others Buddhist barbecues. And she offers to provide them with gasoline the next time they want to do this. So she took a bad situation and, excuse the bad pun, inflamed it. All right? So by the middle of 1963, Diem is increasingly isolated, and it is harder than ever to defend him. Diem is claiming that the communists are causing all these problems. The Americans believe that Diem himself is kind of isolated and that it's his brother and sister-in-law who are the problems. Madame New, by calling them Buddhist barbecues, certainly doesn't make anything easier. So what does this do? It brings the idea of a coup ever more to the forefront. Now, there had been attempts to get rid of Diem from 1955 onward. And this is something to keep in mind when people talk about the relationship of the Viet Cong in the North and the South and everything like that. Who was it who was trying to get rid of Diem from 55 onward? Clearly the NLF and the VC were, but when it came time to stage a coup against Diem, who was doing it? Well, no, the army, the Vietnamese army. The attempts to get rid of Ngo Dinh Diem were engineered by his own people. It was not the NLF or the Viet Cong or the Viet Minh going in and trying to overthrow Diem. In fact, they thought that it was to their advantage to keep Diem in power because he was doing a lot for them. I mean, it was so bad. It was, time and again, Diem's own people, his own army, dissident elements in his own army, quite often Buddhists within his own army, who were trying to get rid of him. Vietnam was unstable. South Vietnam was unstable, not really because of the Viet Minh and the VC and the NLF. It was unstable mostly because Diem had no credibility or authority over his own government, his own military. And the Americans were aware of this. Many, many times, Nolting was approached by elements of the Vietnamese military asking if the U.S. would support a coup against Diem. And each time the Americans said no. From 1960-61 onward. What the Buddhist crisis does is give the Americans, there's another image of this, by the way, further into it. What the Buddhist crisis does is essentially make Americans more willing to listen to these coup plotters. Now, initially, the Americans think maybe we can get rid of New and Madame New, keep Diem in power, right? Because they're really the power behind the throne and everything will get better. But that's not realistic, right? Vietnam is finally emerging as an important national issue because of these Buddhist immolations. And Kennedy has to act. He has to do something. One change that is going to be important is that a new ambassador arrives in Saigon in July, Henry Cabot Lodge. Okay? If you know anything about U.S. history, this is an old family. The Cabots talk only to the Lodges, and the Lodges talk only to God. Lodge's father was a senator from Massachusetts who was the main opponent to Woodrow Wilson's plan for a League of Nations. An old family. Lodge in 1960 had been Nixon's running mate on the Republican ticket when Kennedy defeated him. Kennedy had defeated Lodge for his Senate seat prior to that. So they know each other. They go way back. And he brings Lodge in to become the ambassador. Lodge hates ZM. All right? So Lodge is going to be far more responsive to attempts to depose ZM as well. The typical story, we'll kind of jump ahead a little bit, is that you know ZM is finally kicked out, right? And the typical story behind this is that the Buddhist crisis and the immolations and Madame News comments about Buddhist barbecues and all these things had made it impossible to publicly support ZM any longer, that his own corruption and repression had become far too much for the Americans to tolerate, and so they approve of a coup. All right? But there's something else to that, and George McT. Kahin, K-A-H-I-N, who's written some wonderful stuff on Vietnam, really more than anybody has fleshed this out. I think even more than the Buddhist, the thing that finally forces the Americans to confront their problems with ZM and finally throw in the towel is that ZM and his brother had been having secret talks with the National Liberation Front. What were they thinking of doing? Creating a neutral coalition government. These were preliminary talks between New was the intermediary, No Dinh New, ZM's brother, and the NLF were talking about a coalition government, as had happened in Laos. All right? The U.S. gets wind of these overtures. Now, killing Buddhists is bad. All right? Very bad. Everybody knows that. Okay? And no one advocates the killing of Buddhists, although Americans' opinions of Buddhists are not terribly positive. But killing Buddhists is one thing, but when you go behind our backs, try to create a government, maybe, they're afraid peace will break out. That's intolerable. And I think Kahin's right. This is finally, more than anything, what convinces the Americans to jump ship on ZM. The Buddhist thing, repressive governments do that, and that's something, we can't tolerate any longer. But we can't have him going behind our backs, talking to the National Liberation Front, discussing a neutral coalition government, and cutting us out. Because if there is a neutral government in Vietnam, who eventually is going to take over? Ho Chi Minh. No question about that. And ZM and his brother know that as well. They realize the neutralism is defeat. No question about that. Kennedy cannot accept that. He can't. That's not part of his doctrine. That's not part of his program. So then, John Kennedy, the man that Oliver Stone says was going to get out of Vietnam, what does he do? Well, on September 2nd, Walter Cronkite interviews Kennedy, and he asks him specifically about Vietnam. Kennedy says, "This is Vietnam's war to win or lose, and all we can do is help. But, quote, I do not agree with those who say we should withdraw. That would be a great mistake. I know people don't like to see Americans to be engaged in this kind of effort, but it is a very important struggle, even though it is far away." A week later, September 9th, 1963, Chet Huntley, remember the old Huntley-Brinkley report, some of you, I'm sure, remember that, says the same thing. Huntley asked him the same question. Kennedy gives the same answer. Americans will get anxious and impatient about Vietnam, but, Kennedy says, quote, withdrawal only makes it easier for the communists. I think we should stay. What does that mean? On November 1st, with American approval, a coup staged by dissident ARVN officers takes place. They shell the palace. They take ZM and his brother prisoners. The plan was to put ZM and New on a plane and send them to exile, probably in France. ZM's wife is out of the country at the time. I believe she's in the United States. Madame New is in the U.S. on November 1st, 1963. Kennedy gets word. Kennedy had essentially signed off on the coup, although apparently had misgivings about it. The coup was not conducted by the U.S. or the CIA. It was a Vietnamese military coup. It was an ARVN coup. What the U.S. did was essentially say it's okay. It was probably going to happen with or without Americans. Clearly, American support made it easier to do, made it easier to pull off. But it was an internal thing, right? On November 1st, Kennedy hears word of the coup, and he's, not terribly happy about it, but it had to be done. A day later, they find out Diem and his brother were killed. They were assassinated by the coup leaders, and they found their bodies in the back of a van in Saigon. And Kennedy, when he hears about this, apparently turns white. That wasn't the way it was supposed to have turned out. They get rid of Diem. Diem is now no longer the issue, and pretty soon we'll talk about what happens after Diem, right? So on November 1st, 1963, a 8-9 year phase in American-Vietnamese relations ends with the death of Ngo Dinh Diem. Sink or swim with Ngo Dinh Diem. Well, apparently, at this point, it looks like they've sunk. All right. Kennedy himself, of course, will be assassinated just 3 weeks later. There's the famous funeral cortege. Kennedy, on the day that he was assassinated, was to have given a speech at the Trade Mart in Dallas, a big trade expo, and the text of that speech is really quite strident. It talks about the need to make a stand, and it's not at all conciliatory. So as of November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy doesn't seem to have changed his opinion much on Vietnam. So what then is the Kennedy legacy? I think we'll pick that up next time, maybe talk about it a little bit. Then we'll start talking about what happens in Vietnam after the Diem coup and what LBJ does when he takes over. Make a long story short, he takes a really terrible, poor, lousy situation and he makes the worst of it. Okay?